Welcome to The World This Week here on France 24. I'm Marco, and we've got four excellent editorial minds here to join us and digest the past 7 days of news. Essentially, I'm here just to keep score. Our guests are Andre Neto, founder and correspondent of Headline, headline.com.br, a primary online Brazilian news source. Andre, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
On the other side of our studio, though not necessarily against, it's not that kind of program, of course, Richard Verley, who's a correspondent for France and Europe for the Swiss news website Blick. Great to see you, sir.
Indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Two guests joining us from afar, but welcome they certainly are. In Jerusalem, Iris Makler, France 24's correspondent there, our guide to all matters Middle East. Iris, great to see you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Pleasure.
And from Jerusalem, we go to the far-flung outskirts of Greater Paris to welcome Erin Zaleski, contributor of The Daily Beast. Erin, thanks for being with us, as always.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Pleasure. Absolute pleasure. So let's begin with Israel, where this week there were elections. So whilst the counting was going on, Israeli forces killed at least 4 Palestinians in separate incidents. That was on Thursday, including one who'd stabbed a police officer in East Jerusalem and 3 others in Israeli raids in occupied West Bank. Early Friday, Israeli aircraft struck several targets in the Gaza Strip in response to rocket fire on Thursday evening from the Palestinian enclave. The rocket attacks and Israeli airstrikes were the first cross-border violence since a ceasefire ended a round of fighting between Israel and Islamic Jihad militant group there in August. Let's get back to the election, because in the middle of all of this then, the comeback kid. Well, he's in his 70s, but it's quite a return, isn't it, for Benjamin Netanyahu, winning the 5th election in 4 years in Israel with a majority to boot. But will his new coalition, with its undeniably far-right flavour, leave a bad taste in the mouths of those hoping for peace and cohabitation? No surprises then. Iris Makler in Jerusalem asking you to start us off. Take it away. Iris, over to you.
I will say this. This victory of the right wing is actually quite a confusing victory, because they won by 30,000 seats. That's the difference between, 30,000 votes. That's the difference between the two sides, but it means a 10-seat difference between them. So on one side, there's rejoicing. I was on a train today and I saw young religious men doing a flash mob kind of dance in the middle of the market as I was zipping by. And on the other side, centre-left of Israeli politics, people are actually horrified. They're shocked and they're horrified. And you can tell the extent of it, because today a former Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, who was part of the Coalition for Change, he was the Prime Minister for about a year, he actually put out a statement and said, to all my secular friends, you do not have to leave the country. You don't have to take your children away from military service. It's not such a big change. And the reason he's forced to say that is that this is the most right-wing and the most religious government in Israel's history so far. There are more religious members of this government than there are secular members of this government. That's a first. And I think what you're seeing is many men with beards, many fewer women, and a whole new agenda that is very hard right. And on that basis, people here, I think, are either rejoicing or horrified.
Iris, for now, thank you very much indeed. Don't hesitate to chip in if something occurs to you along the way, because it's a very open forum, as you know. Erin, can I bring you in next from your place outside Paris there? Erin Zaleski, contributor to The Daily Beast. Your thoughts on what's happened in Israel?
I think it's shaken up a lot of people all over the world. I know certainly from an American standpoint, it poses a potential diplomatic challenge to Biden and his administration. And he's going to have to decide whether to meet with these new ministers or new old ministers who have a long history of extremism. And I think Biden's official position is that it supports a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then an independent Palestinian state alongside a secure Israel. And this definitely complicates matters. Again, we Netanyahu had a very contentious relationship with Obama's administration. He had a very close relationship with Donald Trump, further complicating things. So I think it's sort of an election that's being felt around the world, and certainly in the U.S.
This sense of the far right is alarming a lot of people, as Iris was saying. Erin, thank you very much indeed. Richard, can I bring you in from your perspective from the Swiss news website Blick?
Well, what strikes me is that now we have in Israel the same situation we've got in Brazil, in the US, and maybe somewhat in France. We are facing countries divided into two. We are facing a country, two parts of the population, as your correspondent said, who can't speak to another. And that's the problem. There is a democratic wall now in Israel. And this very little difference of votes. So I'm really worried. How can the democratic system continue to work and produce results in a situation like that, where you've got basically not one country, but two countries facing each other?
Indeed. Andre?
Yeah, what worries me the most in this situation in Israel is that I don't have the answer for one question. How far can go the new government, Netanyahu's new government? And I don't know if the democratic system in Israel is under pressure. I don't know if we can go far away from this and have, dictatorial government in the near future in the country. I'm asking these questions because we've been living under a far-right government in Brazil, and we believed for most of the time that the institutionals were enough strong to face the danger, and I'm not totally sure at this moment, So I'm asking the same question about Israel.
Let's put those questions to Iris Makler, who's listening in Jerusalem. Iris, is democracy, is the system, is democracy under threat?
I tell you how democracy could be under threat. There is a push from this right-wing government. It doesn't like the courts. It doesn't like independent courts, and it wants to squash that. Now, that's a pillar of any democratic system. And so this war between the incoming government and the courts, that they are quite open about. One of the reasons is that they want to squash the effect that the court has on certain decisions that are made in the West Bank. There's a lot of settlers in this incoming government, and they want to have the upper hand. The other thing is there's a personal interest, a personal motive for Benjamin Netanyahu. I have heard Israeli analysts say that he had to get back into power because there must be some way, he must find some way to halt the court case against him. Don't forget, he's on trial for corruption offences, and part of the people within this government from that far-right alliance say that their plan is to remove the offences of fraud and breach of trust from Israel's statute books. I don't even know if it's possible or legal, but in that case, I have heard legal experts saying, well, that would end the court case, the trial of Netanyahu, because he can't be tried for something that isn't on the books any longer. So you can see that there are personal motives and also communal motives that will definitely endanger democracy in Israel.
Iris, for those of us who don't know, and there might be people watching who aren't as au fait with matters Netanyahu as you are, just remind us briefly about the charges against him.
There's a number of charges, some relating to interference with the media to achieve a certain political result, and the others, the more colourful ones, and in fact the ones that have been gripping viewing or listening, if you're in Israel, are to do with allegations of accepting cigars and French champagne from various very rich friends, billionaires around the world, in fact.
Indeed. Iris, thank you very much indeed. So 72-year-old Netanyahu, Israel's comeback kid. For Brazil, the comeback kid is Lula. He's 77. Brazil's new president then, Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva's journey from prison to power is the stuff of Hollywood movies, not to mention his rise from dire poverty and his childhood to be elected 3 times president of his country. It is a remarkable story. There's also the matter of a bad loser, too. The far-right now ex-president Jair Bolsonaro. Can Lula eradicate poverty and save the Amazon rainforest? Let's discuss that. But first, let's hear from Jair Bolsonaro, because it took him 2 days to speak after losing the election. There was no great concession straight away, and very little in terms of gratitude or kind of conciliation afterwards. Let's hear from Bolsonaro.
Having the roads closed is harming everyone. The appeal I make to you is clear the roads, protest in another way and in other places, because this is very welcome and is part of democracy. I'm with you, and I'm sure you're with me. The request is let's clear the highways. Let's clear them for the good of our nation and so that we can continue fighting for democracy and freedom.
André Neto, this is a man who, correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't seem to be interested in creating unity in Brazil at all.
Not at all, not at all. Actually, his government is all about dividing people since the beginning, since day one. And I think that he's counting on this to keep the power, even if we had a very clear and fair election last Sunday.
Narrow victory, though, narrow margin of victory.
That's it, yeah. That's it. And I believe that Bolsonaro accepted the result in publicly speaking, not very clearly, by the way, but he accepted the result. But he's managing his crowds across the country to mobilize and maybe to try to stay in power after all. It's quite crazy what's going on in Brazil, but anyway.
In the Israel election, Yair Lapid very quickly stood up and said, OK, I acknowledge the situation, congratulate Benjamin Netanyahu on his victory. There was no such large yes from Bolsonaro at all.
Actually, we are in the same case of Donald Trump in the United States. Actually, Bolsonaro is following the steps of Donald Trump. And I think and I imagine that Bolsonaro is preparing himself, if he leaves the power now, to try to come back in 4 years.
OK. André, for the moment, thank you. Let's go to Erin from the Daily Beast. Erin, of course, we've got Netanyahu, we've got Trump, we've got Bolsonaro. It's like a triumvirate of hard right leaders, isn't it, who basically have the same aim, to divide and conquer.
It is. And I know that there's a lot of... many people are breathing a sigh of relief in Brazil, and I think across the world, and I don't want to rain on the parade too much, but the fact is that Bolsonaro did get almost 50% of the vote, and parliament is still dominated by the right. And so that could make it difficult for him to push his policies through. I think there's a lot of nostalgia for the good old days during the early 2000s of Lula's mandate, when he was able to make a lot of positive inroads and positive policies for the country. And I don't think it's going to just snap back to that so easily. He had a lot of support 2 decades ago that he doesn't currently have. And it's like the U.S. in a lot of ways. The country is very polarized. Almost 50% of the vote did go to Bolsonaro, even though he ultimately lost.
Indeed. And Erin, there's pressure on Lula then to actually snap back into that kind of scenario where you've got the good old days coming back. And like you say, it's a different scenario now.
It's a different world, and then the country has changed a lot. And again, he doesn't have the same support that he did before. And I think just snapping back to how it used to be will be much more of an uphill climb, if not impossible.
Erin, for now, thank you very much indeed. Richard Verley of Blick. Your thoughts?
Well, you said divide and conquer. That's exactly what those leaders are doing, and especially what Bolsonaro did in Brazil. I mean, the country is divided. Now, look at the electoral map, if I'm correct, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong. Lula clearly won only in Nordeste. He was, the key state for the election was Nordeste, which is the most impoverished part of the country. In all the other states, once again, if I'm correct, Bolsonaro won. So how do you manage to govern a country as big as Brazil, with such a diverse society, with such division after an election, if your opponent doesn't acknowledge his defeat? And that's what Bolsonaro is doing. So by not acknowledging the defeat, what he's doing is undermining Lula's mandate from the very beginning. He may not try to take power by force. That's not what I'm saying. But he will clearly undermine Lula's mandate. And keep in mind also that in the coming 2 months, Bolsonaro will still be in power. He will be the face in the international media during the G20 summit in Indonesia in a matter of 10 days. So he will be the one talking with Putin, with Xi Jinping, with Biden, and he's going to use that image, this broadcast, to clearly pass the message that he is still president.
Iris, forgive me, I'm going to Andre Neto for another opinion here. Bolsonaro has two things perhaps backing him. One was Neymar, footballer. But the other thing, of course, is his army background. And the military plays a very important role still, doesn't it, in Brazilian society?
Yeah, but actually that can be the changing the typing point of his government, actually. He always thought that the army would support him to stay in power if he upraises at the end of an election. And apparently, it's not the case. We've been discussing with generals in Brazil. Many journalists have been discussing with generals in Brazil. And apparently, there's no support inside of the general commandment to any coup d'etat.
So these kind of calls that we're hearing from Bolsonaro's people for the army to step in, it's not going to happen.
They are asking this, and for the moment, there's no support for such a move. But anyway, there are 2 more months until the investiture of Lula, and frankly, anything is possible in Brazil at this moment.
Yes, and don't forget that when you take power, you need a transition. Lula needs a transition. And what's going to happen with Bolsonaro is exactly what happened in the US. He's not going to help Lula take power and govern the country. So that's a problem.
Okay, Iris Makler.
I've been thinking about length of transition. It struck me that long period in the UK and now 2 months in Brazil. I'm not sure why it's so long. In Australia, where I'm from, it's pretty snappy. And especially in tense cases like this, it does strike me that perhaps a shorter transition period would be beneficial for everyone, even if there isn't a handover. You know, in Israel, there wasn't a handover. Benjamin Netanyahu couldn't bear to leave last time 16 months ago and you know, barely spoke to the incumbent for half an hour. But it was pretty quick. And I think looking at the overall situation, it's better to be quick, it strikes me.
Before we move on, Andrew, I've got to ask you about the fate of the rainforest. Clearly, Bolsonaro had this policy of developing the area to create, I'll say business. But of course, the greater price would be paid by the rest of the world because of the horrific ecological impact of that. Can Lula succeed in saving the rainforest?
I was talking to Carlos Nobre, one of the most important experts on climate change in Brazil, and he's the most important expert about the Amazon. And he was saying he's supposed to be in Lula's team for environment in the next 4 years. And he told me that he mentioned 11 times the word challenge. It's a challenge. Reducing deforestation is a challenge. Preventing the tipping point in Amazon is a challenge. So that's the feeling of everybody in Brazil. It's a challenge. We have to face it. It's possible, he say. But anyway, we have to start now, and we have to start with a good team. And Bolsonaro has not the good team.
And it's one of those things, isn't it, that Lula will get lots of points internationally about this, but will he get the same reaction in Brazil? I suppose that's the crucial matter, isn't it?
Look, I believe so. I don't believe that Bolsonaro had the support of the public opinion for deforesting Amazon. I think that in this particular case, there are strong support for protecting the forest and to face deforestation in Brazil.
Andre, thank you very much indeed. So Brazil's Bolsonaro, as we've been hearing, great admirer of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, of course, reimposed the full trade embargo on Cuba and put it back on the terror list back in 2021. This week, the UN voted to condemn and ask the US to lift that trade embargo on Cuba. Cuba blames this embargo for all its ills in many ways. And even though it all dates back to 1962, what today seems like another world, of course, the US stands firm on its stance. It was Barack Obama who began to ease things. Trump clamped down again when he was elected. And as for Joe Biden, well, no real positive signs yet of any movement. And there could be a number of reasons why that happens, of course, and perhaps that will sort of lead us to the conversation about the midterms and what's happening there. But starting then with the Cuba embargo. Erin, can I give you first bite on that one? What is your reading of the situation regarding this embargo?
I mean, it does, at this point in time, it does seem to be rather obsolete. And the fact that there's a huge humanitarian catastrophe going on, partially as a result of this. The majority of Americans support the ending of the embargo. The UN has voted to, again, end it multiple times. And the sort of unilateralism by the American presidents, it's not a good look. And while the Biden administration hasn't really, I think there's been some restaffing with the U.S. Embassy in Havana. There's been some very small steps to undo some of the restrictions that Trump had slapped on. But I would say that in general, the policy is a U.S. policy towards Cuba is at a standstill. And there was, during his 2020 election campaign, Biden made multiple promises about shifting that in a more positive, opening things up a bit. But we haven't really seen any action on that. And there's been no clear timeline, even on the resumption of a full resumption of consular services.
Erin, thank you for now. Let's take a listen to some reaction from Cuban people when they heard that the UN had voted to condemn the embargo.
I'm very pleased, very excited to see the support of all the countries, despite the fact that there were 2 abstentions and 2 against it. But, well, it's really encouraging. Although it has no influence on the result, on whether or not they remove the blockade, it really is a great feeling, offers hope, and yes, I'm very happy.
I don't think I can imagine Cuba without the blockades, but I am sure that Cuba would be a better place without it.
So there we hear it, Cuban people speaking about how their lives are affected by the situation. Richard Verley, your thoughts?
My first thought is that we're talking here about an embargo that has lasted 60 years, a population that has suffered, and in the meantime, in Ukraine, there are sanctions against Russia. What I'm saying is that it shows 2 things. First of all, it shows that you don't end a situation with sanctions. Whatever you do, people can stand with sanctions. So I'm not comparing Cuba and Russia. What I'm saying is there is a lesson in this Cuban embargo. The second lesson, there is a word that we've forgotten in presenting the story. The word is Florida, the U.S. state of Florida. Florida will be a key state in the incoming election. Biden can't, he has to do whatever he can to limit Trump influence in Florida. And don't forget that the governor in Florida is probably a presidential candidate for the Republican Party. So Biden cannot move. He has his hands completely handcuffed, and the victims are the Cuban people.
Let me go back to Erin in her part of the greater Paris suburbs. Erin, is that a fair comment? Do you think that because of the importance of somewhere like Florida, the US's policy on Cuba is really stymied or blocked in some way?
I would definitely agree that plays a big role. I mean, there's a huge population of Cuban Americans in Florida who fled the Castro regime, and they're for the embargo. They want to continue. In their eyes, that's a way to punish the Castro, even though he's no longer in power, but it's to punish the Castro regime and the communist regime for as long as possible. And they don't really have an interest in ending it. And Florida is, as mentioned before, it's a key state. Absolutely plays a part.
Indeed. And of course, Erin, there is a difference of approach here. The Democrats, of course, once upon a time signed a treaty which said that once the Castros are gone, the embargo will go. But of course, the Republicans have a very different point of view, don't they? Consistently.
Right. There's divisions of opinion often between Democrats and Republicans. And again, I just think the embargo it's 60 years later, it's obsolete. And I think it's actually served to bolster Castro during the time that he was in power. It almost gave him an excuse for the awful performance of the Cuban economy. There was, which was largely due in part to his policies into communism, and absolutely the embargo played a role, but he used it as a very convenient scapegoat to blame all the economic problems in the country on the embargo.
We're getting plenty of nods here in the studio to what you're saying there, Erin. Let me bring in Andre Neto from the Brazilian news source headline.com.br. Lots of countries going towards the left, including Brazil, which makes certain people in Washington get a little bit twitchy and a bit nervous. I'm wondering about the status of the embargo and what kind of knock-on effect that might have had in Latin America. Is that something that you can tell us about, or is that something that I'm imagining?
No, not at all. Actually, Cuba is a very dividing matter in Brazil nowadays. You can say, well, there are many leftist governments in place now, including Lula in the next couple of months. But actually, there are many lefts in power in Brazil now. If you consider the Chilean president Boric, for example, he's very critic regarding the situation in Cuba. Lula is much more, let's say, friend or much more close to the power in Havana. And you can see other governments in Venezuela, for example, very close to the regime. So there are many different ways to see Cuba in Latin America nowadays, and I believe that this is evolving a lot. I don't believe that Lula will keep his position about the regime in Cuba during the next 4 years, and I don't believe that Washington can resist to all this pressure. Neither. I believe that things are going to change very quickly in the island in the next few years.
Andre, thank you very much indeed. Iris Makler in Jerusalem, I know you've been listening intently and I know you've got lots of things to say. Something's dropped here, which I need to put to you. An advisor from Joe Biden meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, Zelensky, when we last spoke during the Israeli elections, was calling on Israel to help Ukraine. So the Biden advisor says he's meeting Zelensky in Kyiv to underscore US support. How's that going to play where you are, do you think? I'm thinking midterms as well, how this might sort of play with the US. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's interesting, the dance between Jerusalem and Kyiv. Kyiv, with its Jewish president, of course, Zelensky, and its Jewish Hebrew-speaking defense minister have great expectations from Jerusalem that are not met. And they have been it's been a relentless campaign. And I do think that the Iranian drones were a game changer, because we heard both from Israel's outgoing prime minister and from incoming Benjamin Netanyahu that things might change and that there will definitely be more defensive assistance at the very least for Kyiv. So there's this whole question of what Israel can give, because a lot of what Israel has actually comes from the United States. So they're a bit surprised here. Why do you want this stuff from us when we get it from the US, is one theme that I've heard from a number of politicians here. And as for the midterms, in terms of if it is the Republican victory that I have been reading about, I think that would work well for Benjamin Netanyahu. He has an affinity for the Republicans. He's a hard-right man himself, or at least a centre-right man himself, now in a hard-right government. Very good relationship, almost a bromance with Donald Trump. Blown a little bit at the end, but nevertheless, he never had a good relationship, I don't think, with Obama or with Joe Biden, really. And I think he would feel strengthened if there was a Republican success in these midterms.
Indeed, the thought of the bromance between Trump and Netanyahu is making many people smile here in the studio. Erin, I didn't see your reaction when that line came from Iris, but kind of final words on the midterms now from you, Erin, if that's okay. thinking about what happens next, I mean, how important is it going to be for Biden, the actual result of these midterms? And do you think that the conflict in Ukraine is going to weigh on the US campaign at all, given the huge US involvement?
Well, I think what's interesting about these midterms is often historically midterms weigh heavy on US policy in the years to come, or in the final 2 years of a president's mandate. And in this case, they're going to weigh heavily on global policy as well. And Ukraine obviously is a huge issue. There's been certain Republicans have voiced, quite publicly that we're not going to write a blank check for Ukraine. We've taken an isolationist stance. I would say the more Trump-aligned Republicans have argued that we have economic issues here, we have inflation, and we really need to focus more on issues at home and kind of pull back, withdraw a bit of the support for Ukraine. However, there's others who have said that supporting Ukraine is in the interest of national security. So it really, I'm interested to see, because polls, we don't have the results yet, but up to this point, the polls suggest that the Republicans will take the House. The Senate's very tight. We don't know. But in general, public support in the U.S. for Ukraine remains really high. So that could play into it. I know that going back to Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis bolstered JFK in the midterms, but they occurred after a resolution was found, and Biden is still sort of knee deep in this Ukraine conflict, and it doesn't really seem that there's an out anytime soon. Again, there could be more cooperation with Saudi Arabia if the Republicans take the House. The Saudi Arabian leader, he's been very critical of Biden. He's openly voiced his support for Trump. I think there's just a general uncertainty about America's political future, and that always has impacts on foreign policy.
Erin, thank you. Full coverage of the lead up to the midterms, the day of voting, and of course all the reaction and analysis afterwards here on France 24. We can guarantee you of that, definitely. Let's move on to Ukraine then. This week there's seen missile attacks on civilian infrastructure. This causing, of course, power outages in many places. Ukraine actually having to impose power-saving outages in order to ration power around the country. The damage already done to electricity network across the country is immense. On the ground, UN observers say there are no signs, traces, nor evidence of nuclear activity towards building a dirty bomb. Remember that accusation from the Russians. So this gives the lie then to Moscow's much dismissed claims that Kyiv was planning to use one. So Kherson next, in the south of the country. It remains the focal point of the next military activity, with civilians either being evacuated or transported, depending on which way you look at it. The fears that the Russians are planning some kind of an ambush on Ukraine's troops who remain very much on the vanguard. Richard, the situation in Ukraine.
We are entering winter, and clearly I believe there are very few weeks left for the Ukrainian army to achieve their counteroffensive, what they are doing now. So if Kherson has to fall, it has to be in the days to come, because very soon it will be icy, it will be easier for Russian troops, for Russian convoys, for Russian tanks to maneuver, rather than now where you have, the muddy situation. So I believe that the interest of the Ukrainian army is to push as much as they can. Clearly, the fall of Kherson, or the fact that they would take back Kherson, would be symbolically very important for Zelensky. He would be able to tell the world that he is on a victory path. But if something happened, like we are even hearing about the possibility for the Russians to flood Kherson completely. So if there would be an ambush, your commentator said that would be a setback for Zelensky. So he's got Zelensky in his position, he's got to achieve something in the coming weeks. Again, there will be this diplomatic sequence in mid-November with the G20, with other summits in Asia. Putin will be there, Xi Jinping. Zelensky already said that he will not go if Putin is there. But we're clearly living a very important moment. And the way the Russians are behaving might mean that they have something in mind.
Erin, can I come back to you regarding the issue of US support? Because clearly, with what Richard was just saying there about winter coming, US support backing on all levels for Ukraine will continue to be essential.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the main supporters of Ukraine. I think they just passed another, don't quote me on this, but they just passed another $400 million of aid to Ukraine. So I think that it's crucial. But then again, we'll see if the midterms and if the Republicans do indeed take the House, if any of that will diminish in the future.
Because one might think that if the election had gone the other way in 2020 and Donald Trump was still in power, the situation might be very different.
Absolutely, it would have been different. I think that Donald Trump in general had a very isolationist approach to world politics, and he was actually often quite vocally cozying up to Putin. So I think that he would have taken a more hands-off approach and let them sort it out, and absolutely would have seen a different result. And again, we have the American elections in just 2 years, and whether Trump, God forbid, runs again, or a Trump-aligned Republican runs, it'll be interesting to see how this shifts the policy with it. Who knows where the war will be, but it will be interesting to see how that could change support or lack thereof.
Erin, thank you. Iris Mackler in Jerusalem, your perspective from where you are.
I tell you what really strikes me when I hear certain Republican politicians and many Fox News personalities, I won't say journalists, is how much they are, it's Russian talking points coming out of their mouths. So I think the bad hand that was dealt to Vladimir Putin was that Trump wasn't in office to do his bidding, and that Biden called it, saw it for what it was, and has supported Ukraine, has actually changed everything. And I think Putin will be watching the outcome of these midterms as well, because he wants pliable politicians in the US. And there's a whole debate that we could have, a whole separate discussion about how much information comes and misinformation actually comes from Russia and Russian bots and so forth. But it would be very convenient for Russia if there was a strong Republican presence in the next 2 years and a Republican president thereafter, and that they continued mouthing Russian talking points.
Iris, thank you very much indeed. Andre.
I agree with Richard and with Erin when they say, Richard, that we are in the eve of a turning point in this conflict, meaning that if Ukraine forces are not able to take back Kherson, it would be a huge problem for Zelensky because the winter will quite freeze, let's say, the front. And Erin mentioned the perspective of a comeback of Donald Trump coming back to power in 2 years. Can you imagine what can happen in this conflict if Donald Trump is back? And my question is, how will European leaders react in front of this new reality if it comes? I think it's an open question, but if everything, if Donald Trump was already in power now, I would say that this conflict will be in favor of Vladimir Putin.
Andre, thank you very much indeed. Let's move on to our next and final subject. The National Assembly in Paris suspended after a far-right deputy of the RN, that's the Rassemblement National, the rebranded National Front of Front National, bawled out a racist remark. Now, I hate to replay offensive remarks, but I think this one is in the public interest. Let's take a listen.
Pas du tout. C'est violence.
The man shouting out, what he shouted out from the Rassemblement National was Grégoire de Furness. This Friday, he's been banned for 15 days from the French Parliament, and I think part of his salary will be reduced as well, so it's going to hurt him in his pocket too. It's all very unedifying, isn't it, the whole thing? Because he's got an excuse as to what he said, and we'll go into that in a moment. For the record, the man who appeared to be his target in the Assembly was Carlos Martins Bilongo of La France Insoumise, or France Unbowed. And for the record, he was born in Paris in 1990. Erin Zaleski, this is a very unedifying episode in French politics.
Yeah, it's really shocking, actually, and really shameful, I would say. What struck me the most was I believe that he received, I got his name here, Grégoire de Fournat received only a 15-day suspension.
That's it, yeah.
And that's what I think struck me the most. I mean, the United States certainly has a very long history with racist attitudes, and still continues today. We're grappling with racism in the country. But I'm confident that if a member of the House or the Senate made that kind of remark out loud, that would be the end of their political career. It wouldn't be a 15-day suspension. Bye, you're done. So the fact that this man even has a possibility to come back and continue to work in politics is really shocking to me.
Erin, thank you. Iris Makler. Marine Le Pen, his party leader, is defending him.
I'm so shocked. I was shocked to hear it because it's not the kind of thing you say out loud, even if you have those thoughts. And the fact that this man felt confident enough to shout it was very shocking to me. I just heard this story as we were coming on air, and I'm not comforted at all to hear that Marine Le Pen supports him. You have to explain to me, how does that help her?
That's something I can't begin to explain. Richard, can I bring you on this one? Because there's a point of language here.
Yeah.
In French.
Correct.
He said, qu'il rentre en Afrique, which means let him go back to Africa, or let them go back to Africa.
Yeah.
Because it's pronounced the same way. The distinction's in how it's written, isn't it?
Well, indeed, but it all goes with the context. This was during a debate in Parliament. So this deputy, this member of the National Assembly from La France Insoumise, he was asking a question or answering a question on the migrants coming from the Mediterranean by boat. And what the National Front, the National Rally, what Marine Le Pen is saying is that her deputy, the member of parliament from the RN, didn't say retourne en Afrique, so go back to Africa, to the guy from the
Singular,
left. But he mentioned qu'il retourne en Afrique. I mean, that was pinpointing the migrants. So that, and that is a bit blurred. To be honest,
it doesn't feel any better.
No,
does it?
but it is
horrible,
but it is a bit blurred, and it was even blurred in the transcript by the National Assembly. Now, in all cases, that was a racist remark, and it's absolutely unbearable in the French Parliament. But it comes at a disastrous moment for the National Rally, because they are having their Congress tomorrow. So they will be, I would say, punished twice. They are punished by the rules of Parliament, and politically it comes right at a time when they were trying to normalize themselves. They were trying to appear as the good guy, and apparently the next president will be a 27-year-old European Parliament member, Mr. Jordan Bardella. So politically, it's a big blur for them. So Marine Le Pen is actually coming to the rescue of a member of parliament, but she's probably in private very tough on him.
Final word from Andre.
I know that more than 40% of the French electors voted for Marine Le Pen and Front National in the last election, and about 20% or more than 20% voted for Front National representatives for the parliament. And I have something to say. This is so typical of far-right parties. We've been watching this all the time during the last 4 years in Brazil. And this is how people from these parties behave. That's what they think. They are xenophobic, they are racist. And we have to say this very clear and out loud.
Andre from the Brazilian news source headline.com.br. Thank you. Richard Burley from Blick, the Swiss website. Thank you so very much. Iris Makler in Jerusalem of our own stable, France 24. Thank you as ever. And thanks to Erin Zelensky joining us, contributor to the Daily Beast. Most of all, thanks to you for watching. Stay with us. More to come on France 24.